Hi everyone, I'm Corey O'Hara, Nepal Country Director for IDE, an NGO that promotes food security and livelihoods for the rural poor. And today I'll be presenting the results of a longitudinal study that's part of a larger look at measurement of dietary quality and diet patterns in rural Nepal. I'd like to begin by defining a couple of terms. I think that most people are familiar with dietary diversity scores, which have been developed as indicators to answer specific measurement needs. In low income countries, we tend to use them a lot to explain diet quality and food security, and they're often used as indicators in longitudinal studies. Dietary patterns, meanwhile, are more commonly used in industrialized countries as a way to learn more about the eating habits of a population and to understand how those habits relate to human health. Some interesting literature has looked at adoption of dietary patterns over time, but there's been very little longitudinal analysis using dietary patterns like this to date. So in this study, we look at whether patterns are useful to track or explain the impact of intervention over time compared to dietary diversity scores, and what information may be gained from use of pattern analysis. The MAWTW project was active for 2 years in far west Nepal. It was implemented by IDE and had two main intervention types. The first, Treatment 1, or T1, was a market intervention organizing farmers into production groups linked to produce collection centers managed under a cooperative model. Treatment 2, or T2, was an agricultural production and diversification intervention. It included agronomic training and establishment of last mile supply chains for access to inputs, as well as private sector extension services for training. MEWTW was meant to be implementation research, so built into the project was a clustered controlled trial design, randomized at the local level. There was no pure control group, however, because two other projects with similar market development interventions were implemented in the control areas shortly after this study began. That was obviously frustrating from a research perspective, but really it just changes our interpretation of the treatment effect, which reflects combined agricultural and marketing interventions compared to the marketing intervention alone. In other words, T1 plus T2 compared to just T1 as the control or comparison group. The baseline sample was 744 households. There was relatively little loss to follow-up, and a few households were excluded due to missing data. So in all, respondents from 683 households were surveyed both at baseline and endline and included in the study. We used factor analysis to derive patterns from consumption data pooled from the two time periods. We began with the 12 food groups used for construction of the HDDS, and more than 95% of households consumed grains, vegetables, and oils at both time points, so we excluded these groups to avoid skewing results. Two patterns emerged, with the respective food groups shown here in red. The first reflects a varied diet, including several sources of protein and fruit. The second includes dairy and sugar or sweets, and also legumes. Because dairy and sugary foods were very strongly correlated with this pattern, and legumes much less so, we use dairy and sweets as the defining terminology for this pattern. Keep in mind, both of these patterns reflect additional dietary diversity above and beyond a simple diet of cereals, vegetables, and oils, which virtually all households were consuming. Now, we saw radical changes in food environments over time in this area, with huge increases in dietary diversity for all households and increases in adoption of both dietary patterns for all households. This may be an effect of the market development interventions, which again covered control as well as the treatment groups, but likely also broader economic development and remittance flows over the 2 years. You'll note that the factor analysis results in a continuous factor score for each household and dietary pattern, but in the analysis we used tertiles, and these are what you see reflected in the second chart here. Now, to understand effective changes in market access, we did look at market participation, which increased dramatically and by the same amount between treatment and comparison groups. For those households getting the T2 intervention, we also saw expected positive effects on a range of intermediate variables, which suggests that it did successfully promote agricultural production diversity and sales above and beyond the marketing intervention. Here in the main analysis, we see the interaction term shows the effect of participation in the agricultural intervention over time. The exponentiated coefficient can be interpreted as an odds ratio, so this figure shows the probability of increasing one tertile in pattern score over the 2 years of the study. In other words, we can expect those receiving the agriculture and marketing intervention to be about twice as likely to fall into a higher category for a varied dietary pattern compared to those receiving the marketing intervention alone. We would not expect to see greater adoption of a diet characterized by dairy and sugary foods, and we also see no effect on the household dietary diversity score. So, in sum, even as dietary diversity increased for all households, the agricultural production and diversification intervention appears to have promoted preferential adoption of a varied dietary pattern characterized by meat, fish, eggs, fruit, and tubers, but not one characterized by dairy and sugary foods. So, as Nepal's rural areas develop economically, this may point towards specific ways in which the choice of patterns in rural Nepal may be influenced, potentially reducing future risks from a nutrition transition if we can get people to shift away from the more manufactured foods and foods that are less nutrient dense. In sum, we do believe there is a benefit to examining the consumption patterns underlying dietary diversity in more detail, and dietary pattern analysis may be useful, even when applied to the data that field interventions like this one are collecting already. Thank you.